So basically what I'm talking about is to have a very rough background about the DPRK crisis, the rationales, the origins, and the likely consequences, and also a very brief introduction about the delta issues in terms of the possible model of the so-called overlapping sovereignty, but I haven't touched on the background because that would be your expertise. And at the beginning, we've mentioned the rising nationalism in all the countries in the eastern part in Southeast Asia, and how that could be a real problem of the region, and how that could prevent all kinds of innovative solutions from happening. So that's what I've mentioned, but I'm sure your sharing will be much more comprehensive. So I'll get to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here today. Since Professor Shen has already done a very detailed presentation about many topics, including North Korea and theoretical issues concerning territorial disputes, let me just focus on the South China Sea issue and how it can affect regional integration in East Asia. Appreciate it if I can do this in English. My Cantonese is not so good, so let me just try to do this in English. I prepared some lecture notes, so let me try to refer to them. So territorial disputes in the South China Sea, basically there are two major ones, the Paracel Islands issue and Spratly Islands issue. And probably I shouldn't be getting into details about the origins and other details about each of these territorial disputes. I assume that you are already very familiar with the territorial disputes in the South China Sea. So ASEAN has been trying to resolve this issue through their own process. But ASEAN has been criticized by many people as a process-oriented institution. Basically, they put a lot of emphasis on processes instead of making real progress. And basically, more powerful actors outside of the ASEAN region can basically manipulate ASEAN's norms for their own strategic interests. And China is basically exactly doing that. They have not been able to resolve the disputes in the South China Sea through the ASEAN processes, even though they have established a lot of workshops and the dispute has been discussed in various frameworks, including the ARF, the ASEAN Regional Forum. It's interesting to point out one strategy that China has used in the past in order to deal with the dispute in the ASEAN process is very interesting because China began to take a softer approach after 1998. If you remember the history of Chinese behavior in the mid-1990s, China basically took over the Mischief Reef from the Philippines in 1995, and China also fired some missiles into the Taiwan Strait in the run-up to the presidential election in Taiwan. That really raised concerns in various countries in Asia. So China knew that it was causing some concerns in the region, so they decided to take a softer approach after 1998. Basically, what they did is to try to appease Southeast Asian countries by getting closer to them by signing various agreements with ASEAN as an institution. One such document, which is very important when we discuss the South China Sea issue, is the agreement on the so-called declaration on the conduct of parties in the South China Sea. This is just a declaration; it's not legally binding. So, but they both sides have signed this important document in 2002. But basically, ASEAN norms only serve in China's long-term strategic interest. As you may be familiar with ASEAN norms, they basically emphasize the importance of informality or respect for sovereignty, no interference in internal affairs of other countries. and non-confrontation. Those are the important ASEAN norms. And China, after taking this softer approach toward the territorial dispute after 1998, they basically try to manipulate these norms, non-confrontation especially, in order to serve its own long-term strategic interests. In other words, they try to use such non-confrontation norm to try to show their more peaceful side to the ASEAN states, so that in the meantime they can just basically expand their control over what they control in the southeast South China Sea. Another strategy that China can adopt toward ASEAN states is to try to create intentionally divisions within ASEAN. China has been adopting this strategy for a long time in order to deal with the territorial disputes with several ASEAN countries. For example, China can divide ASEAN states into parties in the dispute and non-parties in the dispute. And between the parties too, in the disputes, like Malaysia, Brunei, Vietnam, Philippines, some are more moderate states, whereas like Philippines or Vietnam are more hardline states. They always severely criticize China. So the ASEAN doesn't speak with one voice. China always tries to take advantage of those divisions within ASEAN in order to serve its own interest. If you remember what happened last year in July at the AMM, that's ASEAN Ministerial Meeting, that's a meeting of ASEAN foreign ministers, there was a very strong confrontation between Cambodia, the chair ASEAN country, on one hand, and Vietnam and the Philippines on the other hand. These two latter states, the Philippines and Vietnam, argue that the joint declaration, which is supposed to be issued at the conclusion of the AMM, should include expressions like the parties should respect other countries' EEZs, exclusive economic zones, things like that. And interestingly, at the AMM, Cambodia rejected it, did not agree to include those expressions in the joint declaration. And as a result, AMM failed to issue a joint declaration. And that was the first time the AMM did not issue a joint statement after the meeting. So basically China, you can take a look at, you can explain this Cambodia's attitude by looking at very close relationship between Cambodia and China. For example, China is the largest source of FDI for Cambodia. And China's FDI into Cambodia for the past 10 years, I have some figures here, is 8.9 billion US dollars. As a comparison, you can see the FDI from Japan into the same country for the same period, and that's only 0.5 billion dollars. 8.9 billion dollars versus 0.5 billion dollars. So you can see China has been investing a lot in the country. And also, China knew that Cambodia was the ASEAN chair. ASEAN chair usually has some authority to set the agenda for ASEAN processes. So China had this in mind when Hu Jintao and other top leaders visited the country. For example, Hu Jintao visited in March 2012, and Chinese defense minister also visited the country in the same year. And in these meetings with the Cambodian leaders, the Chinese leader always announced a lot of foreign aid packages. And of course, those are designed to win Cambodia over to China by providing a lot of money to the country. And this, likewise, the relationship between China and Laos is very close. And I can give you some examples, but let me skip it because I don't have much time. So ASEAN, even though they don't talk with one voice. They try to maintain the cohesion, mostly because due to Indonesia's leadership. Indonesia basically took the lead in maintaining ASEAN's cohesion. One example for that kind of new cohesion last year was October 2012, ASEAN Maritime Forum was held for the first time. And that was held in Philippines. And the expanded ASEAN Maritime Forum was also held right after this ASEAN Maritime Forum held. And there China showed a very skillful diplomacy. China promised to provide a lot of money to establish a fund for the forum. And a lot of experts interpreted it as China's attempt to prevent the formation of anti-China alliance between ASEAN and Japan, for example. So you can see China is very skillfully maneuvering to prevent the formation of any anti-China alliances within ASEAN. Taiwan basically is not a member of any ASEAN processes, so when you talk about territorial disputes between China, in the South China Sea, usually people think that those disputes are between China and some ASEAN states, not Taiwan. And Taiwan is basically excluded from these ASEAN processes. I shouldn't get into details on these things. You are all very familiar. For China, regionalism is very important. Mainly because their national goal of peaceful development requires a very peaceful environment in the surrounding regions. And regionalism in that sense is a very important tool in order to gain that national goal. Southeast Asia is of course very important for China for several reasons. And again, I don't want to clearly say what those are, why it's the case. For example, three-fourths of China's energy imports basically go through the South China Sea. And noticing the importance of regionalism for China, China basically established, according to various news reports, in 2004, China established a domestic mechanism at the national level in order to coordinate various government activities for promoting regional integration and regional cooperation in East Asia. I think when you talk about China-ASEAN relations, the important feature is the separation of politics and economics. They don't mix politics and economics so clearly. I know there's a perception of China as a threat as well as an opportunity within ASEAN states. But when they talk about economic cooperation, China is an opportunity for many ASEAN countries. They basically want to have a situation where everybody benefits, a win-win situation, as Chinese leaders always like to say. And one important feature of such important example of that economic cooperation between ASEAN and China is China-ASEAN FTA, which came into effect in January 2010, just a few years ago. And we can argue that trade, I don't have any concrete figures, but you can argue that trade between China and ASEAN has been steadily expanding. And you should also remember that ASEAN states and China agreed to let this FTA come into effect, even though, that's 2010, even though that's exactly when China was beginning to show a more hardline stance on the South China Sea issue. So clearly China as well as ASEAN states are separating politics and economics, and that's a very important feature of the relationship between the two sides. One more piece of evidence that you can cite for China's decision to separate politics and economics, because of the nationalization of Senkaku Diaoyu Islands last year, there are a lot of tensions between the two countries. But despite the Sino-Japanese tensions, China decided to start trilateral FTA, that's an FTA among China, Japan, and South Korea, three North Asian countries. So you can, again, this can be evidence showing that China is separating politics and economics. If you look at the relationship between China and ASEAN in a more broader perspective, many people can argue that the China-ASEAN relations have become the benchmark against which other ASEAN-Japan, for example, relations, or ASEAN-South Korea relations are judged. And one reason for such close cooperation between ASEAN and China is the norm convergence. Basically, if you are familiar with the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence of Chinese foreign policy, they always emphasize the importance of sovereignty, non-interference in internal affairs, and things like that. And by the way, ASEAN norms also include some of those important norms there. So there's norm convergence there that's formed the basis for such close cooperation between the two sides. I just listed some agreements in the early 2000s between the two sides. You can see their cooperation has been expanding into various areas. China, of course, has been increasingly using FTAs for their own benefits. One important example is, again, the China-ASEAN FTA. China, of course, uses FTAs in order to promote trade with other countries. But they also think that those economic cooperation can lead to stronger political relations with those kind of partners that China forms FTAs with. How China approaches their partners for possible FTAs is very interesting, because basically China's approach is very flexible toward possible partners, and they can make a lot of concessions in the process of negotiating for such FTAs. I have some examples here. For example, in the process of negotiation for ASEAN-China FTA, China made a lot of concessions. For example, the Philippines refused to participate in the early harvest program to protect its agricultural sector. Early harvest program is basically you select possible partners, select some certain sectors for early liberalization of trade. But the Philippines wanted to protect its agricultural sector, and China agreed to allow that for the Philippines. You see, China made a concession here. Another concession that China made is toward Indonesia. Indonesia requested and was granted the temporary exclusion of 228 products from the tariff reduction process. China basically allowed Indonesia to exclude those products from liberalization. And that indicates that China was eager to form an FTA with ASEAN in order to back up strengthen their political relations as well with these countries. Non-traditional security cooperation. You may think that there's no such security cooperation between China and ASEAN, but actually one American scholar argues that China and ASEAN have been cooperating in the area of non-traditional security. That's illegal immigrants or terrorism, all these non-traditional security issues. And China basically takes a leadership position in this bilateral relationship. And again, there's the reason why it's so advancing so fast and so further is because there's a non-convergence between the two sides. And some people argue that such cooperation in the area of non-traditional security can spill over into traditional military cooperation. So as well as, there's a lot of cooperation in the economic field, but there's also a lot of cooperation in the security field as well. So I do not think the South China Sea issue will adversely affect economic or political security cooperation between the two sides. Okay, I think I don't have much time. Let me just briefly talk about greater U.S. involvement in South China Sea issue. I think one key incident was the one which happened in 2009, which is called impeccable incident. That's a U.S. Navy's ocean surveillance ship was basically surrounded by 5 Chinese ships in the international waters of the South China Sea. And interesting, the next year, in 2010, China told visiting U.S. officials that the South China Sea was a core interest of China. These days, China doesn't make the argument that the South China Sea was a core interest of China anymore so clearly. Neither does China say that East China Sea issue, the Diaoyu Islands, are a core interest of China either. And that's because China probably learned a lesson from when they told the U.S. that the South China Sea was a core interest of China. The U.S. quickly decided to construct encirclement of China right after that. U.S. was a bit scared that their freedom of navigation would be impeded, hampered by China's aggressive attempt and behavior in South China Sea. So at the AIF in 2010, Secretary Clinton clearly said freedom of navigation was a national interest of the United States. That's of course in response to China's designation of the South China Sea as a core interest. The United States also made it clear that the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty would be applicable to the South China Sea. So that means if the Philippines were attacked by China in some way, then the U.S. would come to the defense of the Philippines. Last year, China-ASEAN agreed to set the guidelines to implement the 2002 declaration on the conduct of parties in South China Sea. Again, these guidelines are not legally binding. They are not really bind China to any obligations. And probably China wanted to buy time by agreeing to these guidelines with South ASEAN countries. I think it's important to look at overall strategic environment in East Asia before we discuss whether regional ASEAN South China Sea issue will affect regional integration in East Asia or not. So, but since there's not much time, just briefly go through these slides. America has been refocusing on Asia, so-called America's pivot to Asia. You can see there's a lot of, for example, one symbolic action taken by the United States is its decision to accede to the TSC. As TSC is Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, created by ASEAN. That's an important document for ASEAN because it enshrines the so-called ASEAN norms. But the United States basically treated it as an executive document with other countries, so that the Senate would not be required to ratify it. And that would be an easier process for the US government. So basically, the US sidestepped such ratification process in order to quickly accede to TSC. And that allowed the United States to become an official member of the EAS, East Asian Summit. And Obama attended the EAS Summit, East Asian Summit in 2011 for the first time. Okay. Again, we're all familiar with what is going on with respect to Myanmar. Myanmar has been very close to China for many years, for various reasons from each side. But the United States has tried to win Myanmar over to its side through various programs. Clinton and Obama visited Myanmar in 2011 and 2012 respectively, and Aung San Suu Kyi, a democratic activist, also visited the United States. And US also lifted partially economic sanctions on Myanmar. And that's all designed to win Myanmar over to China, the United States side. away from China. And Laos too. Clinton visited Laos last year, and that was the first time first visit to the country by the sitting U.S. Secretary of State in many years, like more than 50 years. And Vietnam, the U.S. relationship with Vietnam has been getting closer. They even talking about the possibility of using the strategically important Cam Ranh Bay in Vietnam for supplies and repairs of U.S. naval ships. And that again can send a strong message against China on the South China Sea issue. One interesting point that I can raise on U.S. Behavior is the introduction of this Lower Mekong Initiative. Usually, Mekong River flows from China into the South China Sea, and the countries surrounding the river are usually under strong influence of China traditionally. But again, the United States has been trying to advance into this area by this program. So you can see again, there's some strategic competition between two sides over Southeast Asian countries. I again don't have to talk a lot about strategic competition between China and other powers like Japan and India. Maybe I can talk briefly about strategic rivalry between China and India. China has been increasing its presence in the Indian Ocean. Some news reports recently say that Chinese submarines are increasingly operating in the Indian Ocean. And they're also developing a network of various ports in various countries surrounding the Indian Ocean. And that can be considered as a threat by India. On the other hand, India has also been trying to increase its presence in South China Sea. You may think that India has nothing to do with the South China Sea, but actually India is also doing something recently, especially India recently signed an agreement with Vietnam, for example, for oil and gas exploration in South China Sea. But again, in October 2011, the India and Vietnam started exploration activities in the South China Sea, but China objected to these activities, saying that those waters belong to China. And Vietnam claimed sovereignty over those waters where they're doing their activities, but China said they need China's permission to do so. But India supported the Vietnamese position, and then finally China got angry and decided to conduct international bidding for oil and gas exploration in those controversial waters in dispute. So in summary, China has been basically using very skillful diplomacy to deflect ASEAN's criticism on the South China Sea away from the dispute and toward economic cooperation. And China basically can manipulate ASEAN's norms for its own strategic interests, and China also can intentionally create divisions among ASEAN states.